Well, it is good to be back with you for another week as we are continuing on with our Bible study through this topic right here, ancient practices. My name is Kevin Young, and if you'd like to know more about who we are at Christ Table, the people who are behind the scenes making this possible for you, you can visit that URL right there, www.christstable.today. Would encourage you to consider signing up for the email list while you were there so that you can get all of the information about Christ Table, who we are, what we do. And if you would like to know more specifically about this Bible study, not just Christ Table, then you can go right there to go.christstable.today/ancientpaths. There, you will find the schedule of all of the readings that we're going through during this study, as well as a downloadable PDF of our booklet. And I don't think I have it sitting next to me here, but we have a resource on there, a PDF that walks you through each day, has some extra study questions, some journal space on there as well. You can print that off if you'd like to and have that as a part of this study as we go through all of these 6 weeks. Last week, we talked about prayer as an ancient practice, and we will get to this week's subject right now. Last week, prayer. This week, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about saints. Now, I know that depending on your background, you may have a difficult relationship or an incredibly strong relationship with this idea of saints. If your background is Catholic, if your background is liturgical or Orthodox or one of these other backgrounds, then you have some context for what we're speaking about here. But if your background is a little bit more Protestant, a bit more Reformed, a little less liturgical, then the idea of saints may not only be something that you don't know much about, but maybe even have a bit of a negative reaction to. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to ask us this week, today, for the 4 days that are coming, to just kind of set those preconceived notions aside. Let's just take the text of Scripture at face value and let us see what we can get out of it that may or may not be helpful to us. We'll keep what is good and what seems to be faithful, and we will let go for another day those things which we want to allow to not hold as loosely as others. So this idea of saints, whenever we bring up this term, I know that there is a lot of historical baggage and a lot of positive and negative baggage that comes along with a word and an idea that has been around for so long. And so what we want to do is we just kind of want to make sure that we're all saying the same thing and meaning the same thing whenever we use the word saint. So we're going to take essentially an extremely base level definition that hopefully everyone can agree on, because it's not just a religious foundational definition. This word has kind of found its way outside of religion as well. But here's the definition that we're going to use. People who were celebrated for their dedication to the Christian faith, Christian life, and for the suffering that they endured as a result. And so this idea of a saint is a label that historically the church has placed upon individuals who were standing head and shoulders above other people, who were examples to be looked to in order to follow, to understand what a Christian faith that was vibrant and thriving looked like. And also, and this is the second part of the definition, saints were, especially in the early church, that label, that word saint, was something that was attached to martyrs, people who lost their life, who suffered, who died because of their faith. At stake, lions losing their heads. And so this word is complex. So maybe the best thing that we can do to begin to unravel and unpack this idea of saints is to just kind of jump into Scripture and see what Scripture has to say about this topic. So that's where we're going to be this week. But today, specifically, we find ourselves in two places: Acts chapter 9, verse 41, and Matthew chapter 27, verse 52. And what we're going to do is we're going to look to see what we can find, if anything, about this idea of saints that is helpful to us. So why don't we just Jump right in here. Head first. Acts chapter 9, verse 41. He gave her his hand, and he helped her up. Then he called in the widows and all the believers, and he presented her to them alive. So we're jumping into the middle of a story here, and rather than give you the entire section of scripture here, I've chosen to just focus on one verse. Now, I want to encourage you that maybe as part of your devotional reading today, maybe if you need a little bit of extra credit or you have some extra time on your hands, it might be great for you to just go and read this entire story, because this is an incredible story. Out of all of the miracle stories of Jesus, this one certainly is in one of the top miracle stories there, because it's where Jesus heals this girl named Dorcas. Now, I don't want to give too much of the story away, so I'm not going to talk really anything about that story, but it is a great miracle. It's the miracle, the raising from the dead of Dorcas, Acts chapter 9, verse 41. And so we'll set that aside and allow you to do that on your own. But here in this verse, we have this moment in this verse that is really kind of tied into this conversation about saints. So after she has been brought back to life, Jesus gives her his hand and he helps her up. And then, the room, he asks everybody to kind of leave the room. So he calls back in all the widows and all the believers, and he presents her to them now alive. So what's that have to do with our topic for today? Well, I'll tell you, the verse that is here translated is out of the New Living Translation, the NLT. And if you've been around me for any length of time, you know that the NLT is my go-to translation. That's 9.9 times out of 10 the translation that I'll use. Here isn't helpful. We have to remember that this is it's a translation of an ancient literature text into another language that wasn't in existence at that time. And so something is always lost in translation. Now, the version that you use may render this differently, and the difference is important here, because here in this verse, he calls in the widows and all of the believers. But in the English Standard Version, that verse goes something like this: and he gave her his hand and raised her up, then calling the saints and widows, he presented her alive. Now, it isn't as though the English Standard Version, the ESV, has inserted the word saints here instead of all the believers in order to try to trick us into thinking that Jesus uses the word saints. No, it's actually the New Living Translation. It's the other one, the original one that I use, that changed the word saints to all believers. Why they changed it? Well, I don't think it was, I hope it wasn't just to whitewash this idea of saints in scripture. But the truth of the matter is the word that is there in the original language is saints. And I never would have seen it depending on which version of the Bible I was using. And so unless you're trained in Hebrew and Greek and are used to oftentimes reading in the original languages in order to get a great base understanding of what's going on, I always encourage people, if you're really, really, really passionate about studying, you really need to have several different English translations alongside of you, reading them side by side. Now, that's not going to cut out all of the difficulties and all the things that are lost in translation. Even if you're reading from Greek and Hebrew, there are things that are lost in translation. But having multiple English translations is going to be helpful more than it's going to be hurtful. Now, do you have to do that in your devotion reading? No. My point only being, don't get hung up on one English translation and fight to the death that it contains the full witness of what's trying to be said in the text, because here it's just not true. So what we can take away from this passage is that Jesus actually uses the word saints. And it seems as though, if we're really kind of looking at the context about what's going on here, it seems as though Jesus is using this word saints to describe not all believers, but is using this word to describe a group of people who are different, who are called out, who are a subset of the larger group. So it wasn't like they're saying he called back into the room all of the saints and the widows. that wouldn't make any sense, because it'd be like, well, the widows were included in all of the saints. So it just would have said that he called back all the saints in. So it seems as though what's happening here is that Jesus is referring to kind of two distinct groups that were present here, that were, there's something unique about them spiritually, or there's something unique about them being present in this space. And so the widows and the saints. All right, why don't we go ahead to our second verse, Matthew 27, verse 52. This is when we're here this morning, we are in the middle of Holy Week if you're watching this live. The rest of us, though, if you're watching by delay, first of all, that's okay. I love that. But it's fascinating to me that this text comes up during Holy Week, because this verse is essentially a result of the moments after the resurrection, whenever, not the resurrection, after the cross, whenever Jesus dies on Good Friday. So it says in Matthew 27:52 that the tombs were also opened in that moment, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. Now here I've just gone ahead and given you the ESV. We're not going to play a bait and switch on you, but if you have a translation that you regularly utilize, I might encourage you to look and see what the English word there is in Matthew 27:52. I'll tell you the correct translation of that English word that's closest to the original that was written is, drumroll, saints. So again, what we're talking about here seems to be a special, limited, specific group of people here rather than all believers. Now, it's hard to be dogmatic about some of these things. So we're just, when you read in the Bible, it's always translating, it's always interpreting, it's always trying to bring what you know from other places to bear here on where you are. But at the end of the day, what we seem to kind of have happening here is that these are groups of people whom the Bible seems to, in a few moments, the writers refer to them as saints. And so I guess maybe I would speak directly to those people who have a bit of a friction relationship with this idea of saints, and ask you to maybe dig deep for a moment and reflect on whether or not that is because of your religious upbringing, maybe because of religious trauma, or whether or not that's truly based on Scripture. Because if you're a teetotaler when it comes to this idea of saints, you can't be a teetotaler on the idea of saints and be in any way, shape, or form kind of following the Bible, because the Bible refers to Christians during this period. Well, to Christians refers to followers of God. Let's be very accurate and specific. Refers to followers of God, of Yahweh, in this time as being saints, specific groups of people. So I would submit that that word is not necessarily finished in use, that there are still groups of people around us today who are unique, who are called out, and who are maybe deserving of this idea or this label of the word saints. So as we walk through this week, and we'll bring it in for a close now, as we walk through this week and we're looking at spiritual practices and this idea specifically of saints, what we might think about as you go through your day today is if you were to identify, to create a list of people who were unique in their belief, and we'll say unique in a positive way. These people are good reflections on what they believe rather than bad reflections on what they believe, but maybe not even just good reflections on what they believe. But these people seem to have a level of maturity or understanding or grace or blessing. If you were to group or categorize maybe the most influential or the most godly, the most Christ-like, the most spiritual or faith-filled among the entire group, that smaller group, who'd be on that list? What would their names be? What would identify them? And then, historically, the Bible, the authors, would have called that list of people that you've created saints. Now, you may say we shouldn't be looking to other people for examples, but Paul is known to have said, "Follow me as I follow Christ. Look to me." So there doesn't seem to be anything wrong under certain circumstances in Scripture with looking to other people as great examples of the faith. Well, we'll pick up this story tomorrow as we continue on our journey through ancient practices in general, and this week, the saints in specific. But until that time,